Hi, I'm Andrew McLaren.
And I'm Mark Ridley.
Welcome to the Teamcraft podcast,
where we talk about the tradecraft and sometimes the witchcraft of what it means to work together in a team.
Our guest today is Susie Hamilton. Susie served for 17 years as an officer in the Royal Navy, where she was a marine engineer. After a service career that took her all over the world working on frigates and aircraft carriers, she retired from the Navy and moved into the private sector, working in oil and gas. From there, she moved into the charity sector, where she worked as head of external relations for the Veterans Residences Association. After 14 years there, she recently took up the position of Veterans Commissioner for Scotland, a public appointment that sees her responsible for the welfare and support of all British military veterans living in Scotland, of whom there are somewhere in the region of 250,000. In her role as Commissioner, Susie holds the Scottish Government and public services to account on how their policies and decisions impact the interests of veterans. In this episode, expect to hear about nested teams on a Navy ship, dealing with unexpected change and uncertainty, achieving unity of purpose, maintaining a good sense of humour in a team, good communication, and why teams don't work in industry. You've had a kind of equal chunk of time in the Navy and then out of the Navy. What's different?
Well, I think teamwork is so essential. In the Navy, it's absolutely part of the DNA, and you can't operate, particularly at sea, you can't operate without strong teamwork. And it's, it goes, I think, beyond the normal kind of idea of what a team might be. My short time in industry, it was really different. There wasn't a lot of evidence of teamwork or intent. There was a lot more division. And people who haven't experienced that kind of intense, close working together of service life, I think probably wouldn't necessarily notice their behaviours not being particularly conducive to good teamwork. Moving back into the military charity sector, again, I was working with ex-military colleagues, and there was a strong team ethos. I think it is always different because with service people, you work with them, but you also spend your leisure time with them. Particularly if you're deployed, you have every meal with them. You do your sport with them. You go ashore with them. You do everything together. So it goes, as I say, far beyond what you'd normally think of as a work team, and that is essential, and it has to be like that. And you literally are depending on your shipmates for your safety, and they're depending on you. So it's a very, very close relationship.
Is that what you meant when you said it kind of goes beyond teamwork? Being on a vessel afloat in the middle of the ocean, needing to be entirely self-sufficient and dependent on each other, is that what takes it to a different extreme?
Oh yeah, it absolutely does. I mean, I would say on all deployed operations, whatever the branch of the armed forces, it's always the same. If you're deployed away from home, like say you're literally dependent on each other for your lives, for your safety, then it is it's well beyond a normal kind of employment team. And there's, I think, also the social aspect as well. These are they're your friends, they're your family, really. The people you're living with them, and you might be living with them for 6 months, and they might be the only human beings you see for weeks and weeks at a time. So it's very different from having work colleagues, regardless of how closely you might cooperate with them. It's more like family, and I guess in a way, it's a way that families can have squabbles and arguments and divisions, but they're still family, and it's kind of similar with these sort of intense team working when you're deployed, because you have to stick together, and there is no other option.
What did you do on ships?
So I was a marine engineer officer. So my job was it's an engineering manager role, so managing equipment and the personnel who maintain and operate the equipment. So marine engineering on surface ships, the way I describe it, well, it's everything that's not weapons, sensors, comms, or aircraft. So it's everything that's not the sexy, exciting stuff. So it's engines.
Not things that go boom and bang and whoosh.
No, nothing whizzy. Air conditioning, sewage treatment plant, all the fuel, the actual structure of the ship, the hull, the paint, all these kind of things. Everything that makes a ship move through the water and keeps it afloat.
So I suppose you must have spent quite a lot of time below deck, not outside getting the breeze in your hair.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I spent a lot of time in engine rooms in the ship control centre where that's all down. It's actually, some ships is down below the waterline. So yes, you don't necessarily see outside at all. You can go 24, 48 hours without seeing any daylight. I mean, it's nice to get out to see some daylight, but it doesn't always happen.
Susie, I wonder if you could just talk us through a little bit the team, the sizes of the team that you're working with. So you'll be in the engine room. How many people are around you? What's the scope of your team that you're working in?
So I guess there's lots of different teams. I mean, the whole ship's company is a team, and they absolutely are, and they consider themselves a team, and so that depends on the size of ship you're on. So I served in frigates when that was about 250 people. I also served in aircraft carrier, which was just about 1,000. And people, the ship's company really do identify as, I am, HMS Battle Axe ship's company, and it's very much a team. And then in the department, so the marine engineering department would also see itself as a team, and that would be led by the marine engineer officer at its head, and there might be, again, depending on the size of ship, so it could be about 40 to 50, it could be 150 in an aircraft carrier. And then it's further divided into departments. So, for example, in HMS Invincible, which is an aircraft carrier, I was the hull officer, and the hull department had 30 people in it, so that was a team. And then when we're actually operating the equipment, so we have watches, and so a watch is the people who are on duty for 4 hours at a time, usually.
It's like a shift in civilian.
Yes, it's like a shift. So yes, continually watchkeeping round the clock on the propulsion plant and all the other equipment, the engines and the generators and everything. So a watch could be probably 6 at the minimum, up to 15 on a carrier, because there's always extra people who are learning. So the people who are learning to do the role plus the person that's doing the role. So you might end up with double the number of people on your watch. And again, the watch is a team as well. And you usually have the same watch. You'll be on the same watch for the whole of your trip. So you get to know, you spend hours and hours and hours with your fellow watchkeepers in the middle of the night, talking about all sorts of extraordinary things, just to keep everybody focused and awake with what they're doing for their 4-hour watch.
And how long are deployments? Are they longer on things like aircraft carriers, or does it completely depend?
It really depends. So standard is probably 6 months, but they have been getting longer recently. The longest I did was 8 months, and that wasn't meant to be an 8-month deployment. That was meant to be a 4-month deployment, but we got retasked in the middle of it and sent from the Caribbean to the Gulf, which brought its own challenges. And out of that deployment, we spent 2 months without going alongside at all when we were in the Gulf. So we spent a whole 2 months at sea, just us. I mean, it's a fairly large ship, but that's quite a long time to spend just with 1,000 of your closest friends.
Yeah, talk us through that. Because there must be, you've talked about these nested teams. So you've got your 1,000 of your closest friends, but you've also got your watch, and then building up to your department and so on. What's the psychology for that team when you are nearing the end of what you thought was the trip, and it's just been blown wide open, and there's a whole lot of uncertainty and change.
Yeah, so there was a lot of uncertainty with that particular deployment because it was a very fluid political situation. So initially, we were in the...
When was this? Sorry.
1990. So we left 1997,
Right.
97, 98. So it was to... The purpose of the Gulf deployment was to enforce the no-fly zone over southern Iraq pre-Gulf War, to try and prevent a Gulf War. So in retrospect, I know it wasn't that effective, but it was it potentially delayed, I guess, a Gulf War. So we'd been in Florida, and our next stop was Costa Rica anyway. And then the news came through that the politicians at home in Westminster decided to send the carrier, this first of all, just back to the Mediterranean in preparation for potentially going to the Gulf. And we left very quickly. We left so quickly that we left 86 people behind because they'd gone on a trip to Disneyland and hadn't left the contact details. And so when they carried out the recall, everyone was at 48 hours notice. So after the 48 hours, 86 people hadn't been able to get the message, so they had to stay behind in Florida until we could get them to fly back out to the ship.
And that wasn't their fault. That was just the way it worked out.
Oh, it was their fault. Yeah, it was their fault. They should have been contactable. Yeah, it was their fault. Yes, there was. Yes, whatever they'd done, they hadn't left the hotel number, or not many people had mobile phones then, so it was definitely their fault. There weren't too many consequences. I think the worst punishment for them was they had to be accommodated on an American carrier that was tied up alongside in Jacksonville until we had aircraft to bring them out to the ship, and I think that was probably punishment enough. So there was a lot of uncertainty, and there were people who had things planned, weddings, their wives were having children, we were about to give birth, and we all thought we were coming home in time for Christmas. Everyone had bought their Christmas presents in America, so we were due home on something like the 19th of December. We didn't know whether we would get home or not, so there was a lot of uncertainty. And it was very much down to the leadership of the ship as a whole and the departments to keep everybody focused and also to prepare them for the fact that we were going to an operational situation. And we found, by the time we found out they weren't coming back, the chefs had already defrosted the turkeys for the Christmas lunch, which we were going to have on our way back up the channel. So we got told we weren't coming home for Christmas. Everyone had to phone their families, which caused a lot of upset, as you can imagine. Somebody very enterprising organised for an ISO container to be filled with all the Christmas presents that people had bought, and that got taken. A lot of stuff got taken off the ship in Gibraltar, so I think we managed to get that off as well. We still had to have the Christmas lunch because the turkeys had been defrosted, although nobody was feeling very festive at that point.
No, I don't
and
imagine.
The tradition is that the officers serve the junior ranks their Christmas lunch, and so we were doing that, trying to be jolly, and nobody was really feeling in the mood particularly. And we hung around in the Mediterranean actually right through Christmas. We had Christmas at anchor off Cyprus, and then I think we had New Year in Palermo in Sicily, and then we eventually got tasked through the Suez Canal down to the Gulf in January. We didn't know when we were coming back, and it just wasn't. It was a leadership job to make sure everybody just kept focused on the task in hand when there was so much uncertainty about the actual ship's programme. And we came back in time for Easter in the end.
And you were an officer, so you were in a leadership position at this point.
Yes.
Yes. What did you do, and how did your team react, and what were the challenges that the team faced in your department?
Well, I think we were facing the challenge of preparing for an operational deployment that we weren't expecting. So we had some engineering things to focus on, quite a few engineering things. We had defects, so we had things that needed repairing. We had because my department included things like fuel, we had to think about all the logistical aspects of fueling, going through to the Gulf, and we were getting some RAF on board, and they had different fuel, and so there's all these so we had technical challenges to think about, which was good because it's good to keep people occupied, and really there's nothing worse than bored service personnel, nothing worse. And also obviously everybody had family issues and there were issues at home as well, so there was a kind of that twin job of making sure that the ship was prepared and we were ready for the task, and being supportive of our personnel, and that a lot of that is down to having a good sense of humour. So it's very important, and humour always forms a big part of dealing with these situations, I think, and that does help. I mean, there were some genuine, what I would call, welfare cases, and these were dealt with appropriately when we do have with specialist welfare support from back in the UK on those cases. But for the rest of it, it was being sympathetic, but also keeping a sense of humour. And I guess from my point of view, even though at times it felt a bit like it did feel difficult, but not showing that to the team, and just trying to provide an example of getting on with the job.
I keep coming back actually to the point that there's 250 or 1,000 people in a confined space. You're the only humans that you see for a long period of time. It is absolutely always going to be the case that there are going to be challenges between people. So there'll be disagreements that need to be resolved. And it's more important than ever in that situation that you do resolve them. I'm curious how that's handled, and in asking that question specifically, whether there is anything in the training that is done about how to handle the tension.
The training is quite intense. So everybody's individual training is quite intense, and as part of your training, right from day one when you go into basic training, you can't pass training unless you're good at teamwork. So teamwork gets you through your training, whether it's basic training for ratings and other ranks, officer training. Then when people are promoted, they go on more leadership courses, and again, you don't ever get through those courses unless you have that ability to work within teams. So I think it's potentially the training is kind of innate. It's kind of inbuilt into everything that you do, and also there might be an element of filtering out somebody who's really not going to be able to get on with in those sort of close teams. I think that sort of unity of purpose is really important. People understand the unity of purpose, and that's something that always comes from the command, and the command is always very good at doing that. I mean, very clear about the unity of purpose, which helps the people to focus not on their individual kind of disagreements. And I think it's also something that you can learn, and then everybody does learn if they're going to get on at sea in these kind of environments, that they learn to just get over the fact that they don't like some people, or that they might have an argument with somebody, but that has to be secondary to getting on with the task in hand and getting on with the purpose of what you're doing.
The closest that I can imagine to that kind of situation is working with startups. So obviously in industry there are big businesses that are quite stable, but that idea of people that really come together and feel like a family and are in a high stress situation with a very clear goal, and it's very time sensitive. My closest experience to that is these small startups, and these are generally quite small groups of people, and normally much earlier in their careers. It's very common to find a number of the things that you've talked about. So they're very well bonded. They feel like they spend every hour together because they really do work and play together through everything that they do. And they seem to gel much more closely because they're at the earliest stages of their career. And I remember this from when I was working together. It was very, very common that becomes your family. But the critical difference that I see in what we're describing, as well as how important it is the performance is maintained in your situation, the critical difference that I see is there is no real training around teamwork. In that situation, people working in startups are generally selected because they have good technical skills, in whatever field they're working in, but not necessarily because they work well together, and they're never trained to work well together. And it's really interesting how you describe implicit in the training is that we will work well as a team. And I'm really interested how we might make that more explicit. How could we learn from what the implicit training is that you go through and actually call out these are the things that teams can learn from?
Well, I mean, the training involves doing what team tasks, and there's a leadership model that was taught when I was doing my officer training. I think it's been superseded now. It's called action-centered leadership, and it has 3 points, which is task, team, individual. So team is in there, and it's, so you absolutely, you do get lecture in that, and talk about this is what you should be doing. You're thinking about the task, you're thinking about how individuals get you on, but you're also thinking about the team. And we do, and officer training, I guess, we do quite a lot of so I'll do some of the psychology behind teams, and we do some of the kind of the Belbin team stuff, so they do some of that as education. So that there is some of that, and actually I think that's helpful, illuminating, but probably more helpful is putting people in team situations where only by working as a team can they actually succeed. And that actually there's a very strong focus on sport and adventurous activity, which again is absolutely brilliant for team building. You're literally in a team, but there's lots of adventurous training where you absolutely have to have a team, have to have a strong team ethic in order to succeed. So having all that inbuilt as well. So I think a combination of some education and practical experience of real life situations which do have some peril in them, which are genuinely sometimes are a bit dangerous, that really helps people to kind of hone their team building and team working skills.
Are there episodes you can recall on deployment where you're seeing that team climate degrade, or you're aware of problems in the team, and what were those problems and what was the way to solve them?
Yeah, I mean there were personality clashes.
Is that the most the most common one? Does it quite often come down to personality clashes?
I guess it's personality. Yeah, sometimes, and the other one I guess is you sometimes get people who are maybe just not pulling their weight, and that becomes evident, and that does cause resentment. And so when that's identified, your remedial action has to be taken with the individual to find out what's behind that. If it can be resolved, and ultimately, if not, they can get moved to another position, sometimes even removed altogether from the ship if that's what it takes. I mean, resolving the sort of personality clashes, there's a number of different ways, from getting people just to face up to each other and try and do it that way, take them ashore, try and resolve it in a kind of social setting if that's possible. Sometimes it needs to be just a firm lecture that their behaviour is not acceptable and it's not helpful. Probably it's been individuals who sometimes have been promoted to a position which is beyond their capabilities. I think that happens in many fields, and I've seen that happen.
And when you say capabilities, do you mean leadership interpersonal capabilities or technical capabilities?
Yes. Yeah, usually leadership interpersonal. And if that becomes quite evident, and that can cause some real fault lines, and I've seen that, and which has resulted in people leaving the ship altogether because it wasn't sustainable to have them in the position.
I think this is exactly what you alluded to, but I'm almost looking for any specific examples that you have of this. Did you have to actually step in and manage this kind of situation? So you have seen a disagreement between people and you felt, okay, they're not going to resolve that themselves. This is the point I need to step in. So you mentioned you might take someone ashore, but was there any times that stood out? Obviously, don't name any names. Were there any times that stood out where you had to intervene?
I mean, yes. I mean, I think one or two occasions where it's been a physical altercation and had to intervene with that. I mean, born of frustration, boredom, tensions building up. Yeah, that's happened once or twice, and I certainly had to have one-to-ones with individuals to say that that usually they needed to improve their performance, and it was usually performance related. So there's performance issues that need to be improved because it's causing is causing problems with the watch or with the department.
You've mentioned that as an example of a source of conflict, a source of tension in a team is people not pulling their weight, also known as social loafing, also known as the Ringleman effect. The way in which that manifests in the Navy, is there a kind of set of behaviours where you try to perform the way that you're doing your job to make it clear to your teammates that you are pulling your weight? Is there a kind of performativity attached to ensuring that there's a sense of contribution going on when you're carrying out your role?
I think because the roles are well defined, so a lot of it's task based, and so that's well defined. And so doing that, there's also always, everybody is always training for the next position. So as part of, or they should be. So when everyone gets their appraisals, it's not just about their current performance, it's about their potential, and it's about what they're going to be doing next. And for many, they literally are under training for years, continuing to move on to the next position, and a lot of that's technical training, but it's also some of it's personal as well. So it becomes obvious if people are not doing that. But certainly if people are not doing the task-based work, things are just not getting done. It would really come to me as the officer in charge of the department. Really, it would be dealt with at a level of, their immediate line manager, their leading hand, or their petty officer would very quickly be on them to ensure that they're, whatever it is that they've been doing, if they're not doing it if they're not up to scratch, if they're not doing what they should be doing, then that usually gets dealt with very quickly. And it's usually very obvious if it's task-based work, that it's not being fulfilled properly, or even if it's just not. So if they're living in a mess, for example, with other people, if they're not keeping their part tidy, if they're not doing the communal duties that need to be done, all these kind of things, it gets noticed very quickly, and there's actually pressure from peers, from shipmates, to make sure that gets done before it even goes anywhere up the chain. And there's always more senior people around, even if they've only been on board, a couple of months more than the next person, then there are always people there to provide, first of all, I guess, guidance. Yeah. But if it needs it, you get that peer pressure to, as I say, to muck in, do what you should be doing, and make sure you're pulling your weight.
So let's go back to the other half of your career, off ships, onshore, in civilian life, both private sector, charge sector. I mean, the first thing you said when I asked you about the differences was, in industry, they weren't really teams. So why not? It was a bit of a culture shock for me, because that was my first job outside, and having joined up at 18, it was my my first job that wasn't in the Navy. Really. I was coming from an experience of everybody almost unquestionably working together and pulling together. And I went to a company where there were different departments, where actually I think the department heads were somewhat at odds with each other, and there was competition. There was lots of internal competition, and there were some people who just weren't very well motivated either. So, there were people who were doing a 9 to 5, and their only motivation was their salary, really. So it was a different environment, and I guess there was less need for a really strong, close team, because the company was performing perfectly well and could do what it needed to do, just with people turning up, as long as they turned up and did their jobs. So there wasn't really, I guess, the need. It probably would have been better with better teamwork, but it wasn't. Nobody was in danger due to the fact that there was lots of competition and fair amount of hostility between various people in the company. So that's interesting in that you recognise hostility, maybe you could call it an unhealthy atmosphere, a greater variety of evident motivation around their jobs, but at the same time you recognise that, well, teamwork wasn't necessarily actually the thing that was required in order to get the job done. So what was wrong? Do you know what I mean? So would teamwork have solved those hostilities? Tell us more.
So I think, in certain extent, as I say, there were issues. So I think there could be better performance. I think there were lots of young engineers there who would have been growing and learning better themselves if they were, in a team. There were a few very talented, very, very clever individuals who were individualistic, and they were needed for their technical expertise. I guess it would have been great if they'd been able to share their technical expertise and taken on more of a mentoring role, but that wasn't going to make immediate money, I guess, for the company, and they were needed more than anything for those technical skills that they had. I think things like maybe the quality work would have improved with better teamwork, and I think retention would have improved, and there was a retention problem. And I think that aspect of it, there wasn't a particularly friendly atmosphere a lot of the time, and so for young people, there were graduates coming in from university and it was their first job, and the retention of them was pretty low.
Do you think there's a bit of a vicious cycle there, especially in industry where you've got, particularly in areas where high levels of expertise are necessary for the kind of jobs, the kind of work they do? As you say, those kinds of people, they're hired in for that expertise. They're not hired in for leadership, and they may not have really ever been trained in any of that stuff. So that attitude breeds a culture that is not very conducive to education, mentorship, bringing people along. But that in itself means that everyone expects to move on, and the organisation doesn't see a reward in investing in things like teamwork and culture and a supportive atmosphere.
Yeah. There was definitely, I think, an element of not wanting to invest in lots of training because it was felt, well, the people are moving on. Why are we wasting money? Which, is a bit back to front. So if you go back to the invest in people and they will stay, it would have. I think would have improved things. I think maybe because it was a highly technical environment, and the people who were fantastic engineers who were bringing a lot of money into the company, they were quite honest about it. They weren't really people, and they didn't want to be, and it wouldn't have worked trying to put them into a mentoring role anyway. It was not their sort of personality type, and so I think there were attempts to try and have more of that, but I think because there were also in internal kind of divisions and I wasn't there for very long, so my short time there, I didn't see them actively achieve get anywhere with improving the team support and the mentoring. After I left, there were the size of the company actually reduced, so there were fewer staff, and that might have been the answer.
I wonder if I could just ask a question about communication, and particularly because you've experienced life both in the military and in the civilian world. Did you notice anything striking about the way that goals were communicated in the military, and how and it could be in the language that was used or the way that it was delivered? Was there anything that struck you about this being different in the two worlds?
There's certainly much more communication in the Navy. There is literally a daily brief in the evening from the executive officer who always talks about what the purpose is of what we're doing, maybe talks a bit about what's been done that day, what's coming up, what training we're doing. So literally daily, and then circulated documents such as the ship's programme, the short cast, the long cast will always include what the purpose is of what's been done. So it was really clear, and the captain would always worked really hard to make sure everybody understood what they were doing, not always necessarily why, but usually why we're doing it and what they expected. And I didn't see that so much in industry. I think it was generally everybody knew that it was the company was being run for a profit, but there was certainly much less communication from the senior leadership as to where the company was going, what the plans were, what contracts were coming up, what customers were, which customers were being sought. And so there was definitely less of an idea of what the purpose was of what everyone was doing.
Reflecting on this, it's definitely one of the things that I try to be very aware of in different companies. They have different cultures with different levels of communication. But I have certainly been in places where they roll their eyes again when they're told that they've got another daily briefing, and they question the value of it. It's interrupting my work. Why would I need to go? I'm very aligned with making sure that the purpose is very clear and communicated. It's really important. And I would love a team to feel that that was valuable. But often the team will just be, why are they interrupting my day with this? We're just hearing the same as yesterday. So do you think there is something substantially different in what is needed in those two different environments?
Yes, I mean, I think it's very much down to the pace of what you're doing. And if you are on a ship, on a deployment where there's new evolutions every day, every night, I would write night orders every night for the overnight on watch teams, so they knew what was expected of them overnight, and that would include when to wash the engines and that kind of thing. So there is definitely a requirement for that. I certainly wouldn't expect daily briefings for a shore-based engineering company that everybody knows, but monthly briefings. I think we actually had weekly team meetings, which even then sometimes nothing would change from one week to the next. So that was definitely maybe overdone, but certainly monthly briefings. And there's other ways to communicate as well. So just having that the mission and the vision really clearly in everybody's mind, so everybody knows if you ask them what is the mission of your company, and they can actually tell you. I do think that's important. Yes, you don't want to overdo the toolbox talks or whatever they happen to call them, to the point where nobody finds value, I guess, hitting that sweet point. And it's about making sure it aligns with the kind of pace of the activity and the things that are going on.
It really strikes me, because I work generally in technology companies, so generating companies building digital products. And it's really striking that I find that there is a really wide pendulum swing between sometimes hearing from executives. In fact, in the last 2 weeks, I've heard both of these. In one instance, somebody saying, I find it difficult to convince the chief executive to set objectives quarterly because they feel that that's too regular. And on the other side, I can't believe that we have to go to a meeting every day because they're not valuable to me, and I'd rather actually be doing the work. Those businesses aren't so different. Going to these different businesses, there are these wild swings, but they're not so different from each other that those two statements should be true. And I wonder if there's anything that you've seen around. Obviously, you mentioned some of those cadences there, but that difference between setting a strategic objective, a purpose, and setting a daily set of tasks without micromanaging. Is there anything that maybe you have taken from your experience in the military that then, in an ideal situation, you would follow? So if you were running a business, what is the cadence that you would like for those two types of engagement?
I think I've certainly seen the weekly team get together is really of value. I think that is nearly always a good timescale, because of just to go over short-term objectives, and also it is really important to meet your team. Sometimes that's on a screen, but even better if it's in person. It's really important to see your team regularly, because you can see sometimes without even talking to them, you can just see by looking at them whether things are going well with them or not. So just in terms of that individual part of the task team individual triangle, it's really important to see your team. And I think weekly is a good one for all managers. Maybe not at the sort of managing director level, but I think they'd still want to be seeing their directors pretty regularly, so you can just see how they're getting on. I would always want to do that, and I would worry with senior leaders who don't want to see their team members something like on a weekly or fortnightly basis, to be honest.
It strikes me that it's what you were talking about with the Navy. Once you get into, say, the commercial world, like what Mark's talking about, I get the sense that sometimes people find it very difficult to differentiate between a kind of discipline hygiene factor that is indirectly going to make the work more purpose-driven, more efficient, higher quality, and the work itself. So all the things that you've been saying, whether they're setting a strategic direction or whether they're daily task briefs, it's a sort of discipline, isn't it, that is evident throughout the armed forces for sure, as an example, where they have this robust framework they follow and they always do it. And as you say, that means that sometimes it might not be completely obvious that there's something directly coming from it, but it gives you a contact point with the team, which means you see that someone's not happy or there are problems that were otherwise undisclosed, or it clarifies something that people didn't know needed clarified, or you weren't aware of a connection. And it does strike me that some businesses, for sure, they quite easily let that sense of discipline drift, or they don't recognise it as a discipline that leads to productivity.
Yeah, I think there is a risk that businesses don't value the people as much, and that's something that is very much in the military is one of the prime considerations. So we call the handbooks in the Navy are called books of reference. So there's a book of reference about managing people, and it starts with a picture. On the front is a male and female sailor, and it says the single most important factor. And that's the very first page of the book, and so valuing people is absolutely essential, and that it's potentially, if that gets lost and that individual part of the task team individual triangle corner is missing, then I don't think businesses do perform well. So that's having that, as yes, you could call it a discipline of always making sure you're considering the individual while you're considering getting the task done and making sure the team's working is, I guess, that's what I was taught, but I think that does still work, and it is really important. The most important thing to remember, and that goes right back to Nelson's time, I think, with his band of brothers. It's about the individual, and also it's about making sure they know what you're thinking, without you don't have to keep telling them, because they know what you want, and that's what Nelson ensured, and I think that's what all good commanders do is they make sure everyone knows what they want to see and what the results and outcomes are that they want to see.
So I wanted to give you the opportunity, Susie, to tell us about all of this stuff you've learned working in charity sector, private sector, in the Navy. How do you approach your role as Veterans Commissioner with all of these experiences, and are there things that are top of your mind that are priorities when you're leading, engaging with teams? I imagine you probably have to engage with all kinds of different sorts of teams or conversations in your role. Yes,
I do. I have my own team, a small team who work with me, and then yes, I'm part of various advisory boards and other kind of sort of looser organisations. I think it's listening is really important. Listening, and also listening to all the non-verbal cues as well, is really important in all of these. And being able to move from being the team leader to being the team member, and to be able to flex the different roles, because I absolutely have different roles, and that's really important to be able to be completely flexible, because sometimes you're absolutely just there to be a supportive team worker, and you don't always have to be the person in charge.
Our quickfire questions are short questions that require you to give short, first thing that comes into your head answers. They're not nasty questions. First of all, what are your team red flags?
If there's open dissent or criticism that's not supportive, is a real red flag for me.
What's your best team memory?
That's a really difficult one. Yeah, I guess probably coming alongside in Portsmouth after a long 8-month deployment, and everybody's families being on the jetty and knowing that we've all got home safely.
And finally, if you could pass on a resource about teamwork, and that could be a book, a podcast, anything of that sort, what would that resource be?
There's quite a few things like the life of Nelson, or kind of military histories. So a lot of them, sometimes they're slanted on leadership, but there's always a huge element of teamwork. So, and there are libraries full of those resources. But I would start with Nelson is a good shout.
So, The Life of Nelson by Christopher Hibbert. Fantastic. We'll link to that in the show notes for sure. Thank you so much, Susie.
Thank you very much for listening, and thank you to Susie Hamilton. In the show notes, you'll find links to the Veterans Commissioner website. You'll also find Susie's Pass It On resource, Nelson, A Personal History by Christopher Hibbert. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.